Well, a very good evening and a warm welcome to Trasna Natira. My name is Dominic Price, historian and author, and tonight we have something very special for you indeed. We're going to hear about one of Ireland's most beautiful and iconic historical artefacts as Professor Robert Stalley delivers his lecture on the art of the Irish High Cross. Professor Robert Stalley is Fellow Emeritus History of Art at Trinity College, Dublin, where he's Professor of History of Art for 20 years. He's a highly respected member of many historical and archaeological societies in the United States, France, the United Kingdom and Ireland. He's a member of the Royal Irish Academy and the Academia Europaea. Professor Stalley has written many award-winning books, including Cistercian Monasteries of Ireland, Early Medieval Architecture, and just published in the last 2 weeks, Early Irish Sculpture and the Art of the High Crosses. You're most welcome, Professor, to Trasna Natira.
Thanks very much, Dominic, and hello, everybody. I'm delighted to have a chance to speak to you all tonight. Particularly, it's on a subject which is dear to my heart. I've been living with for over a decade now, and thinking about, and it really came about a good 15 or 20 years ago now, when one of my students said to me, if you don't believe everything that is written down about the high crosses, why aren't you writing a book yourself? So I took him up as his word, and that's what I've done. And in a way, a lot of what I've learned about the crosses has come out of teaching and having to, think about them in front of a lot of very bright students. And it's clear that a lot of what is actually generally said and even thought about on crosses is perhaps in many cases only a half truth. And there are a lot of exciting issues which are barely considered, and actually some never really explored at all. Now, much has been said about the crosses, but most it tends to be based on the subjects, the sort of scenes you see there on the screen, the scriptural scenes, crucifixion obviously is there, but almost nothing is said about the craftsmen who made them, or nothing about how they were made either, or perhaps more to the point, who actually paid for them. What I've been trying to do is to set the record straight as best I can. And I think the ideal place to start is two of the greatest monuments we have in the country, fantastic monuments at Monaster Boyce. And of course, they'll be familiar to most people, I guess. But that's part of the problem, because they're so familiar to everybody who lives in Ireland that we take them for granted. And we must remember that there's actually nothing quite like these two crosses, or nothing really resembling them, that was being made at the same time in Europe. I'm talking about 900 AD or thereabouts, or shortly afterwards. No, there's no sculpture like this at that time anywhere else in Europe. And it's not just the stupendous scale, and they are big, and that's easy to forget too. It's the carving itself, which is really remarkably sophisticated, very subtle in many cases, often very witty too. And the fun, the amusement, and the sheer creativity of them all, it's not brought out perhaps as much as it should be. Now, one of the first things that I think about when I look at the crosses takes me back to my student days when we were learning about sculpture, stone sculpture. One of the things that we were always told is we had to think of what did the block look like before it was carved? Where did the stone come from? And that's one of the things that that I've been concerned with. But alas, when the various guides and so on turn up at places like Monaster Boyce, here they all are. This is a group not perhaps engaged with the monument as much as they might be, one or two looking a trifle bored. And I've listened so often to guides coming there. I've spent a lot of time at Monaster Boyce, you can imagine, not just the odd hour, but days, and they come and go. And the guides, they do their best and they explain a few of the scenes, but before long, people, they move on. And part of the reason is, of course, in this day and age, many of them really are not, they don't know too much about who Moses is, Cain and Abel, David and Goliath. And I just feel all the time they're missing the point. they said nothing is said about the sculptor and the cleverness of the sculpture. And of course, the folk move on, you know, after about 5 minutes, and somehow you just feel what an opportunity lost. So I'm glad to say there is one person right in the front with a red rucksack who is taking a bit more interest in it all. But as I say, one of the things that we were encouraged to do was to think of what did that look like as a solid lump of stone. Now, it's largely made of one stone. The very top cap is separate. We can probably see the joint, and the base is separate. But that huge central area is a massive block, 14 feet or more, 4 meters plus high. And here I've kind of, I'm going to go on and talk, it's really my first part of my talk, to explain how things were made. Construction is how I've called it. And so we gave my crude diagram there, but that's just to give you an idea of the scale of this block that had to be extracted from the quarry. And it's not just the height, it's the width too. And to get a block of stone, it's sandstone, it's a very fine sandstone with quite a lot of quartz, it glints, it's a lovely hard wearing stone. To get a block without flaws was really quite an achievement. And for years, people have been saying, well, where did this stone come from? And, you know, that has long been a mystery. Many years ago, Frances Henry suggested, you know, she thought there was a site near Dundalk, but that really has come to nothing. And it's only in fairly recent years that, well, I've been helped enormously by geologists. One of the great things about working in a university is there are all these experts on hand in different areas which can, you know, advise you. And I'm very grateful to one particular geologist who guided me and pointed out there was really only one site anywhere in the neighborhood which was going to produce stone like this, of this quality, this fantastic quartzy sandstone. And I think the argument is compelling. And he took me to this place called Carrickleck, which is right in the border of Northern Meath. And it's between Nobber and Kingscourt. Now it's about 14 miles, or what's that, 22, 23 kilometers from Monaster Boys. Now that's much further probably than one would tend to send, you know, expect, you know, people to get their stone from. But that's probably just a mark of the quality of this stone. It was the quality that mattered in a way more than perhaps the convenience of the location. But what is really exciting about this is the name Carrickleck, because of course Carrick stone, leck bed. The very name of the place implies it was a quarry, the stone bed or the flat bed. So that again, and that name goes back at least to the 17th century, if not long before. So off we went to explore the quarry, and I've been there a number of times, and here it is. It's been used for over many centuries, so there's no hope of finding the exact spot from where the ancient stone would have been drawn from. And now the quarry's been abandoned, and indeed the site's been closed up, and it's very dangerous. But I think you can perhaps see, particularly in the upper reaches there, some of the straight bands of the sandstone of the sort of length that you could imagine they might have been able to get out back in the years shortly after 900. But of course, it's one thing having a quarry, but you've also got to, well, you've got to have quarriers who can manage to extract it. My guess is that they probably got it from near the surface and actually laid out a flat surface and cut all the way around rather than taking out of a side face. But of course, the problem then is you've got to shift it to the site. And that's another very interesting issue, because we're looking at that big stone I showed you must have been about 10 tons or so in weight. But obviously a cross is okay, the major block being that weight, but the cross is only taking up about half of it. So it would make very good sense, therefore, to cut the cross into shape at the quarry, because you're going to halve the weight. And I don't think there's any doubt about that. That was medieval practice in general. So this is very interesting, because it means that a lot of the real activity takes place not at the site, the religious site, but actually at the quarry. but you've still got the problem of transport. Ideally with stone, its weight, river transport is the perfect way to get a big block moving. But there's no river that will bring you conveniently from anywhere near Carrickleck to Monasterboice, so it had to be overland. And this day and age, the overland method was ox carts, and we have good references to that in the early sources. Not just a single oxen. I was always on the lookout for ox carts, and this, I'm afraid, is rather rather a digression. But this is an ox cart in Delhi, and anybody who's been to India will immediately be amazed at the fact that so much of the transport is sort of pulled by oxen. Of course, there are cows and oxen everywhere in India, but anyway, that was why I put that particular shot up. And as for the cart, well, we get pictures, of course, of, well, that's a chariot really from one of the crosses at a Henny, but it's unlikely that's a two-wheel chariot. That's probably not the sort of thing we're looking at. We're almost certainly looking at a four-wheel cart. And I think there's an Irish word car, which would probably fit the bill for that. So that's probably the sort of transport we're thinking of. But as I say, the undressed block must have weighed 10 tons, so they could have reduced it by approximately half. So what would it look like? Now here's a cross up in the north of Ireland at Errigal Keerogue, where you can see they've shaped a cross, but they haven't cut the ring. The ring is there, but they haven't cut through. Now, we don't know whether this particular cross was always intended to be like that, or whether it was a cross which is actually unfinished. But I think that's probably the sort of shape we must imagine across, the initial carving to have taken place at the quarry. That's its form, and in that form it might be, as it were, moved to the site. But the point that I think is important is that the basic design of these high crosses was already decided at the quarry, which must mean the designer is at the quarry. And if he's the chief mason too, it's quite possible, at least it's an open question, that he may be involved in the quarrying as well, because quarrying was not a major enterprise at this time, because early 10th century, very few Irish buildings were made of stone, and those that were tended to use rough rubble rather than actually quarried stone. So it was quite an unusual and specialised craft, I suspect, at that time. Anyway, once you get your cross on the way, you still have problems. And one thing is that it's very easy to break the thing, and you could have spent weeks, not to mention all the energy, actually extracting it from the quarry, transporting it. And there are signs that they did have accidents. And this is one of the most spectacular cases in County Wicklow, where you can see it's the site of a quarry, and you can see the outline of a Latin cross, just a simple cross shape there. But can you see the stem on the right is broken away? And this actually was carved out of a boulder. And they literally were carving the cross at the quarry site, or where the stone was. And they shaped it, still with part of the boulder left at the back, and then they came to turn it. And the moment at which they turned it, the whole thing sheared off, snapped down below. I would love there to be an excavation at this site to see whether, who knows, maybe some of the tools of the trade are lying underneath that cross, ready to be discovered. We don't really know the date of this. It's pre-industrial, but it's a warning or a reminder. It was a tricky and potentially dangerous operation. Now, another thing that was often done at the quarry, I would guess, is that in some cases, this is an unfinished cross at Kells now. Can you see that many of the panels have not yet been carved? But before they were carved, they were, as it were, lined out on the actual face of the shaft. And it seems that that was probably done at the quarry as well. Obviously, you wouldn't go in for any detailed carving, because the dangers of that being, anything being broken en route would be you know, obviously fairly likely. And then, assuming that our cross gets to the site, well, you've got the golden question, which comes up all the time in the history of sculpture, particularly sculpture applied to buildings, but generally, when or how did they do the carving? Did they put the stone up and then carve it, or did they carve it in advance on the ground? And that's an old chestnut in Ireland, and people have taken different views on all this, but certainly a fair amount of the carving had to be done beforehand, because if you look under the arms of Murdoch's cross that you see there, it's carved. So if it was already standing up, you couldn't have carved it there unless you wanted a shower of stone bits coming down in your face all the time as you carved. And indeed, medieval practice was almost invariably to carve on the ground or in a workshop. And the likelihood is that that is how this was done, or how these crosses were done. But again, at this point, you're going to have to cut the ring. And here, about 10 years ago, I was really fortunate because the Office of Public Works put up a scaffolding around Murdoch's cross here. And the one thing I wanted to do was to look down what I call the armpits. You see where you've got the ring and then it has this hollow, and then you've got this curious roll. Can you see that going through, which was a sort of ornament, I guess, at either end. But I want you to notice something. Where the point of the arrow is, you see the roll bends. And there's a reason for that. Because imagine you've got this great slab lying on the ground. You're going to cut out these sections in the ring. If you go right the way through the stone, all the way through, 1.5 feet, how do you know you're going to come out at the right place? There's a big danger that you'll go left or right. And so once you look on the other side, you'll see you've made a mess up. So what they did is they carved halfway through, turned it over, and then came back the other way. And you can see quite clearly there, they weren't going to quite meet. And they actually did meet, but they met at a junction. And I've been looking at crosses ever since then, and you find it on a very considerable number of them. So it's a very kind of obvious technique when you think about it, but it just underlines the difficulties of carving or going about constructing something on this scale. Now, as I say, Murdoch's cross is all of one, largely one piece, as you can see. I haven't explained, I should have explained, because it's called Murdoch's cross because of the name of the abbot. I take him to the abbot anyway, whose name is there between the two cats. Can you see the two cats there, just above the base, at the base, bottom of the shaft? And written around them is the famous inscription, which says, "Pray for Murdoch." So Murdoch's cross it is. But the other great cross at Monaster Boyce is made in a different way because it's got two major chunks. The great long shaft, and I've, in a very extravagant way, I'm afraid, sorry, I've sort of given you an impression of the two pieces. One just a straight shaft, and the other is the head, the ringed head. And they were made of separate blocks of stone. And you can see why they might want to do that, because if you wanted to make your cross higher and higher, you know, this was the only way really you could do it, because you're never going to get a piece of stone. This is, all told, what is this now? It's nearly 20 feet in total height. Well, it's over 20 feet in total height. So you have to make it, you make it at two parts. Incidentally, that would also make it easier to ship the stone from the quarry. But the downside, you've got to have a joint up at that top section there, the upper red line. And what you've got there is a mortise and tenon joint. In other words, a hole and a slot on one piece and a hole in the other, and they slot into each other. And that's all very well. But the question I put to everybody is, how the hell did they do it? Because they're going to have to lift that top piece, and that must weigh 2 or 3 tons at least. They're going to have to lift that at least 30 feet in the air just to slot it in. I'm going to have to slot it in vertically and very carefully. So that means that before you lifted up or, you know, finished any of these crosses, you needed some pretty fantastic machinery, cranes, hoists of some sort or other. I've tried to give the impression there, sorry, this is a bit low tech, but if that's the top section, the separate section, and then of course we go down, bang, it's in place. Just if you didn't see that, bang, there it goes again, down into its, in its position. Now that joint was always a point of weakness. And there were about 20 crosses which were made in this way. And they are the more ambitious ones, obviously. And in nearly every case, that joint is broken. And in a few cases, they've been patched up and repaired. And I think that was the case here at Monaster Bois. But of course, that got me thinking about cranes. And just to give you an idea of what a big task it was, this is the OPW moving one of the crosses at Clonmacnoise a few years back. And look at what the scaffolding they've had to erect to lift up the cross. Now, it's not nearly as high as the Monaster Bois ones, but it's a pretty, impressive structure. So we've got to be thinking in those sort of terms. And the standard sort of hoist that was used in Roman times and then on into the Middle Ages, and still to this day, is the three-legged hoist that you see there with a pulley in the middle. And my guess is that it probably is some version of that was employed. And I was told a year or two back by somebody who's, I think through his father, was very familiar with the erection of Celtic crosses in graveyards, and said that's exactly the way they were doing it until certainly in the 1950s, using these hoists. And I couldn't believe it. About 2 years ago, no, I tell a lie, 2016, 4 years ago, I went out of my house and down the road, and what did I see? Fingal County Council had put up a three-legged hoist in order to, I think it's drainage or something they were working at. So it's a pretty standard technique all the way through history. So that's a few points about construction, which I say is something which is just taken for granted. But these crosses, they were, extraordinary pieces of engineering, certainly, the major ones. But what about the sculptor? So it's time perhaps to look at the sculptor. And of course, we have no names. We can identify them, though, in a different way. We can identify them as individuals on the basis of their style and their technique. And this particular man, this is Murdoch's cross, two sides of it, he's instantly recognizable. Once you've got the hang of his style, you just see him there quite clearly. He cuts in quite deep relief. And I think that shows, do you see what I mean? The depth of the carving back into the stone in both of these cases is quite significantly higher than in almost all the other crosses in Ireland. The bodies, the way he carves the human bodies is very rounded. Do you see how the limbs and the bodies, they're shaped in a sort of, not a flat section, but everything is sort of in a rounded shape. And there's lots of movement. Look how Adam and Eve are walking towards each other, and they twist and turn. And on the right there, this is, that scene on the right was often used to be thought to be the arrest of Christ, but in fact it's not, it's the mocking of Christ. It's very clever, because you know how Christ was mocked as King of the Jews. Now, how does the sculptor show that? Christ is in the center. And what does he have? He has the insignia of an Irish king, the brooch, the fantastic brooch. Do you see the penannular brooch on his chest? So that's the way he's kind of brought out the whole idea. And of course, he's got in his hand, he's got the rod that Christ was given by the soldiers. But there's more to it even than that. A lot of his figures are shown, I call them tiptoeing along the frame. Do you see that? Frame is kind of a base, like a stage, and they're just sort of almost hovering on the edge. And he loves his details of his swords, the brooches that I've mentioned there. But the thing which is most extraordinary are the trousers of the two soldiers. The only thing I can describe is that they remind me of hot pants, which everybody, well, not everybody, but not many to say, were wearing 20 or 30 years ago. These tight, extraordinary garments, which they've got. And just to show you another trick this sculptor has, do you see Adam and Eve on the left? Then just to the right, we've got Cain clubbing Abel. But can you see that the hemline of Cain's robe, it kind of goes up over his knee. That was a trick played by the painters and draftsmen, because if you're doing a two-dimensional drawing and you just lift up the curve of the hemline, it gives the impression that it's going three-dimensionally around the body. So this man, this sculptor, you know, he's full of tricks and clever devices, and you've only got to compare him to other sculptors of the day. This is a bit extreme, admittedly, but this is the Cross of Moon. Everybody knows the Cross of Moon, of course, because of those Mr. Men figures, but and this extraordinary kind of flat geometrical form they take, almost certainly inspired by metalwork, probably. But I mean, it's such a world apart from our guy, you know, and there you see them, as it were, as I say, Adam and Eve moving so easily that you feel that his figures are perhaps a little bit overweight a lot of the time, and certainly Adam and Eve look well fed in the Garden of Eden. Anyway, mustn't digress, I guess, but I've got another comparison for you here. This is a cross at Kells. Our man, I think, worked at Kells, but not on this cross. And there's another Adam and Eve, slightly different way of portraying them. But I ask you, there's no way they're by the same sculptor. And I think it immediately shows that our man is in a different league. Figures firmly planted, moving. And look at the size of the heads on the right, huge compared to. So he's a much more sophisticated sculptor than effectively any of the others that we have at this time. And he's easy to spot at other places. He worked at Clonmacnoise. I'm sure he's the master of the Cross of the Scriptures at Clonmacnoise too. And I wanted just to point out one panel which is on the side. And of course, the original is now in the visitor centre, but here it is on the left. I think this is a fantastic piece of carving. And everybody walks past it. And look, what have we got? A seated figure. Look, he's enthroned. You see his curving chair. He's got a great staff, and bang, it goes straight into the eye of the guy down below. And is it a child or is it somebody older? Hard to say. And of course, you can scarcely believe it, but he's got his hot pants on too. It's the same trick with his garment. And so this is our fellow all over. And you've got, look at the size, the scale of the head, the rounded shape and so on. And this is particularly interesting because what's the bird doing? And this actually goes back many centuries to the Roman world, because what the sculptor has done, somewhere he's seen images of Roman emperors or major Roman figures. And what do they always have? A staff, often with an orb, and on the top of the orb is the Roman eagle. And the Roman eagle gets transferred into these supposedly Christian subjects, though nobody's quite sure what this subject represents. It's often said to be David, but to me, it looks more like a figure of authority overcoming evil. Is it, you know, a victory over unbelief or something more along those lines? Anyway, the point that I've been trying to make all the time is there's an assumption that somehow medieval artists showed little interest in creativity or innovation. You know, they just did the same old thing much of the time. And it's quite untrue. It's just time we recognized, I think, far more the talent. Also, obviously the sheer skill at carving, but also the imaginative talent of some of these individuals. And I think this particular sculptor worked at least 6, perhaps 7 sites. I mentioned Monasterboice, the 2 crosses there, and Clonmacnoise. There are 2 crosses at Kells where I think he had a hand, and at Durrow as well, and possibly Duleek. And incidentally, another thing that several of those places, Monasterboice, Kells, Duleek, have in common is they got the stone from Carrickleck. It's this, again, the quarry is as it were, all important. So I like to call this sculptor the Murdoch Master after we don't have his name, so let's give him a name, and then we can give him a bit more humanity. And that's another thing I'm keen to do, is to put the humanity back into the history of this time as far as we can. And it's quite a lot of work. I guess we'd be looking at 10, 15, 20 years of work if he really was full-time on all those projects that I've been mentioning it. And of course, the great thing, we do have a good idea when he lived, because on Murdoch's cross, should perhaps go back to that. No, I've forgotten. Anyway, on Murdoch's cross, we have the inscription, and Murdoch died in 924. So we know that he's working before 924 at Monaster Boyce. But at Clonmacnoise here, the inscription, there's an inscription, 2 inscriptions here, damaged, but they mention Cling Flan and a Cormac, and this is Flan Sinner, and various that can be linked up with various historical references, and we can be fairly convinced that this cross was made to go with the stone church behind in 909. So you've 909 and pre-924. Well, it's too good to be believed. You know, in medieval art history, you have so few dates. And when you get 2 beautiful cherries like that, you know, this is just terrific. So we can plant him firmly, I think, into a, you know, historic environment. And I think he was in charge of the subjects too, because you see that at the bottom of the cross here, Clonmacnoise, if you look closely, what do we see? Well, along the bottom, we've got a body, and the head is at the left with a rather, well, it looks like a very pointed nose. And can you see 3 crosses? That's Christ lying in the tomb. And then you've got, as it were, the tomb lid, or the tomb itself, part of the tomb itself up above, and then a bird or a spirit breathing into Christ's face. And then you see up above the 2 soldiers, both of whom have got pointed helmets and their spears. And then a figure coming from the right, perhaps 2 figures, they'd be the Marys, perhaps approaching the tomb on Easter Day. So this is a subject which really represented more the, not so much the death of Christ, but the resurrection, actually, of Christ on Easter Day. And our man produced that on 4 occasions, or versions of it. And there it is at Durrow. You see the 2 spears are there, the 2 soldiers almost knocking heads in the center, and it's damaged, unfortunately, in part in shadow, but you can see where Christ's body was below. So it's very interesting that it's not just style with to have in common, it's almost as if he's, you know, he has access to the subjects, to the iconography. And it's not just that either, it's all the decorative work, because of course I've just dwelt on some of the figure carving, and it's in the figure carving you tend to see most easily the, you know, the style, the individual style. But look at this, that's Clonmacnoise on the left, Monaster Boyce on the right. And these are the undersides of the arm, and particularly at Monaster Boyce, because it's the underside of the arm, so it gets less wear and weather. And you see those little faces all very well preserved from, let's face it, 1,000 years ago, and the snakes forming, as it were, a kind of frame around them. It's brilliantly done. And at Clonmacnoise, you see the cat all twirled up there. That too, I think, is, and that's very typical of this man. There are a lot of quite naturalistic animals that appear within his sculpture. So right across the board, you see all these connections. So, you know, this is my case that he's, you know, one of the great men of Irish art. And on the right there, of course, you've got this famous hand, the blessing hand at Monaster Boyce. A lot of people, I've had students stand and stare at that for many a long minute, trying to work out which side of the hand is it? Is it the underside or the palm? And some people think they can see fingernails. So it's almost as if the hand is holding up the upper part of the cross, but others would prefer to see it as a blessing hand. So if you're kneeling down below, it probably a lot depends on whatever model the sculptor had in mind as he was doing it. But before I leave the figures and their snakes, look at the heads of the snakes. He had a rather weird way or a weird view of snakes. Perhaps not surprising. I did say I think he's Irish, so perhaps he wasn't very familiar with snakes, but he tends to give them the heads of cats, which again is one of his hallmarks, I think. And this, of course, is one of the most famous of all his carvings, the 2 men at the foot of Murdoch's cross, pulling each other's long beards. Now, of course, pulling somebody else's beard was not the done thing in early medieval Ireland. And, but it's a subject which crops up, and a lovely example there, 1, 2, 3 in the Book of Kells, with pulling ears. There's that famous story, I'm not quite sure, that I think Geraldus Cambrensis tells, of King John coming to Ireland. And King John, is reputed, or was he Prince John at the time, reputed to have pulled the beards of the kings of Ireland, which of course was not diplomatically a very smart thing to do. But beard pulling has all sorts of connotations, some of which I better not go into. Anyway, just before I leave the style of this man and all his ingenuity, just a few more points just to show his imaginative capacity. And you see this on the great Last Judgment at Monaster Bois. Now, this is one of the first depictions of the Last Judgment in Western art, and as such is an absolute landmark. And I'm going to just show you've got Christ in the center, the judging Christ. And here you've got the weighing scales. The souls are being weighed. One scale empty on the right, the other scale with the soul. And then you've got Michael coming to the rescue with a crozier. And the point of that is stabbing straight down, and it's rather decayed, but it's actually going straight into the eye of a demon. And you see the little legs of the demon, or maybe the devil, over on the right. And I love the way the sculptor has taken so much trouble over the ironmongery. Do you see how the chains and the hooks are also carefully done? And then here's hell, in case you wanted to know a bit more about it. You see on the left there, the fellow demon with a fork leading the way, and then right in the middle there, another demon kicking everybody into hell, with a book presumably listing the damned. So, that's the creativity of the man. And I've said earlier that I'm convinced he's Irish. No, there have been suggestions, quite serious ones, that he's a foreigner brought in from France. Well, I don't believe there's any shred of evidence to support that. And in fact, there's plenty of evidence to the contrary. And lots of little details tie up with Irish art. And this is a man who is very familiar with the context and things that are going on around him. Just to take one little detail there, this is the judgment at Durrow, and I'm looking at the angels there. And actually, I'll just go back and show you there. It's the, you've got, as we look at Christ holding a cross and a flowering rod, just to the right of Christ as we look at it, can you see an angel, hands held up in prayer? And you see his wings coming down, and there it is, a detail of it. Notice the top of the wings end up in a great spiral. Look to the left. That's a detail from the Book of Kells, from the Evangelist St. John from the Book of Kells. And the Kells artist does it, and our man does it. It's a kind of trick, you see. And there are many other examples. So I have no doubt at all that he's a man who's, very familiar with not just Irish sculpture, but Irish painting. And as he almost certainly worked at Kells, what's on the doorstep? The book is there for him to look at. And even if he didn't, I'm sure there were so many other metalwork and other artifacts, that sort of design was being repeated. Now, it's how did he set about the carving? I mentioned earlier how a lot of the stone would be marked out where you would have a panel. And people have said, well, that's a bit odd. If you're going to carve that, why do you go so much trouble to make it so smooth? Well, the answer, of course, is because you're going to draw on it, because you're going to do the outline drawing of your composition on the surface of the stone. And it actually made good sense for them to do that. And of course, when it comes to actually carving, how is he doing it? It's the tools they used in the Roman world and the tools they use right through to modern times. And I took that photograph on the right of a sculptor who was doing a copy of one of the Scottish crosses. And you can see He's got a punch, the first one on the left, and then he's got a claw, chisel, all sorts of pointed punches, more flat-bladed chisels up on the right. And that drawing on the left is a 12th century drawing of masons at work, as you can see there. Now, there's one thing that isn't shown there, which our man definitely used, and that is a drill. Because if you look at the insides of the interlace, consistently you'll find that it's a circular hollow, and that's something spinning around. So that has to be a drill. And drills were indeed commonplace and used from the Roman world right through the Middle Ages. And the sort of drill that they used is called a pump drill, or a bow drill, because it looks a bit like, I suppose, a bow and arrow. It's hard to put into words. This is a fantastic painting in Italy, but although it's much later in our period, it just illustrates the form so well. Can you see how you've got a horizontal piece of wood with a hollow, and you can pull that up and down, and as you pull that up and down, the string spins round and spins a spindle in the middle, which is of course your drill. And a drill was a very important element for the medieval mason, because it was that enabled him to get deeply into the stone without cracking it alongside. And that would have been used for a lot of this sort of detail. This is Monaster Boyce. I love showing this shot because there's only about an hour of the day, and only in certain times in summer you can take this photograph, because it's the north side and the sun just comes on it, obviously in the summer only, and it just catches the light of all this fantastic interlace, which normally wouldn't show up very well, and most people, they just walk past. Incidentally, there are our beard pullers down at the bottom, but it's this has to have been painted. You can see that it's paint that would bring out all these designs. And of course, we've got no direct evidence of paint in Ireland, but paint was used on the English crosses at the time. So, I'm pretty sure it was painted here too. Now, oh yeah, one of the things that's always said about this sort of ornament is, oh, well, that's something that the master carver would lead to his assistants. And I never understood the logic of this. Why would you let your assistants play merry on important, conspicuous part of the cross if, they weren't as good as you, or they weren't up to the task? I suppose they could have been by assistant, but it's very interesting. You can match these patterns around those crosses that I was mentioning. The patterns of the interlace, I won't go into them. It's the most awkward, tedious subject, really, in many ways. Interlace patterns, complicated too. But the point is, the actual designs are matched, and it's clearly, you can see it's all coming out of the same, you could call it a workshop. I prefer to see it in terms of really one individual. But you don't really want an incompetent doing it, because if you do, you might get that happening. Follow the interlace here. Something has gone wrong down at the bottom, and a few threads have been dropped. This is at Kilkieran in Kilkenny. And, it's hard to know how this could have happened. Did somebody make a mistake? Was it deliberate? Or was there a kind of logical mistake? It's hard to know. But all I'm using that as an argument for is saying, the interlace and the other designs are just as demanding as the figure sculpture. No reason to suppose they're a sort of lesser product. Now, I want to give you a shock here. I took this photograph in 1978. I was back there last year, and that's the same. This is Kilkieran. And that is just horrifying, because what's happened is an awful lot of moss, but there's a huge amount of lichen, white lichen, which has covered the whole of that base. Up until the late, well, about 1980, I'm not quite sure the exact date, it was normal for these monuments to be sprayed in order to kind of kill off the algae and the other growth, but that became banned, and now it's not done. And the botanists adore lichen. And you can't get rid of it. They think lichen is just the greatest thing in the world and far more important than any carving which you might see. And so I went innocently a few months back to ask botanists, you know, how could you get rid of lichen? And I was so stupid because, of course, if you're a botanist, the last thing you want to do is to get rid of the plant or the thing. And of course, all I was told is, no, lichen is so important. You mustn't get rid of it and it will help preserve the stone. Well, it might help preserve the stone. I've got doubts about that myself, but it might help to preserve the stone. But at what cost? At the cost we can't even see or admire the actual sculpture itself. But I must finish quickly because the last thing I wanted to talk about were who paid for it. Who were they? Who commissioned these crosses? And here we get, I think, one of the, well, I don't know, it's one of the major misconceptions. This is the image of the cross, of crosses, often portrayed everywhere, school books, the lot. And here you are. What it says is, and it actually says so in this particular case, that the great monuments may have been used to tell the stories from the Bible to a congregation. The point of these monuments was, it's supposed, was to instruct the lay folk, ignorant fair folk. Well, to be honest, the picture isn't all that convincing because it shows Murdoch's cross in a lovely open landscape, which clearly it wasn't at the time. They all look fearfully, well, maybe not. Some look more enthusiastic than others, perhaps. But I hope it was a sunny day because when you think about it, if you want to instruct the faithful with images, outside of the cross with some of the images high up above the ground, it isn't the most perfect way of doing it. And then bear in mind as well, the vast majority of crosses have very little figure carving. So I'm very dubious about, you know, whether that was ever really a major reason. But of course, there's a difference between something being given as a justification and the actual reason. And in the Middle Ages, for any grand abbot or bishop who wanted to spend money on some grand project and just show the glory of his own, I don't know, bishopric, monastery or whatever, what way would he do it? Well, art, carving, great buildings. And if he had to justify that expense, he would always say, it's for the glory, you know, it's for the glory of God. And the standard justification throughout the Middle Ages was that images were there to teach ignorant folk. But actually, so many of the images the ignorant folk would even get to see. And it's you know, we mustn't take it at face value. That clearly wasn't the case in a great many examples. In case of Ireland too, a lot of the subjects we get on the crosses, they're quite esoteric. They're not actually, you know, the sort of basic thing that you might use to instruct a poorly informed laity, assuming they were all interested. And so my point is that these crosses were designed to impress and impress the, you know, your peers, not so much some sort of wonderfully democratic notion. They were designed at Monasterboice or Clonmacnoise to extol the glory of that particular ecclesiastical settlement. A second misconception, which again I'm you know, think is certainly needs critiquing, is the notion that almost all the subjects on the crosses are biblical. They are not. And there are clear references to the local site. And one of the best is here at Clonmacnoise, where there you see that nice panel on the right. And if you look closely, you can see the left-hand figure. He's an ecclesiastic. He's wearing ecclesiastical robes, quite elaborate ones, I think. And extraordinary, he's got a bag on his back. And it's very much, he's very much a Murdoch Master figure with his rounded face and so on, and all the detail. And on the other side, the right, you've got a bearded figure, long hair down his back, a belt, a sword, and they're holding a staff of some sort in the middle. And this has traditionally been interpreted as the founding of Monaster Boyce by St. Kieran and King Dermot. Now, what really interests me is that around the time that this cross was being made, a life of St. Dermot, of St. Kieran was written at Clonmacnoise, and this very scene is described in it. The two of them planting the first stake of the, I suppose, timber or whatever of the monastery. So I believe, as I think nearly everybody does now, that this is a foundation panel. This shows the foundation of Clonmacnoise. But is it an exception? Well, you know, I don't think it is, because if you go to Scotland, this particular cross at Dublin in eastern Scotland, it's moved now, it's been moved into the nearby church. And when it was moved, a close examination realized it was appreciated there's an inscription on the back, or, you know, well, I suppose that depends on which is front, which is back, but anyway, there's an inscription. And that was read, and it mentions the name Constantine MacFergusa. He was king of the Picts, and he had that cross erected. And there he is, riding on horseback. And down below, you've got 8 armed warriors. So this is quite blatantly a political as well as a religious monument. And they were doing it in Scotland, and I think you've got hints of the same thing in Ireland, because here on the base of the Cross of the Scriptures, Clonmacnoise, you've got 3 horsemen at the top, 2 great chariots down below. And in the past, there have been massive efforts to try and interpret these in a Christian context. You know, academics are brilliant at intellectual gymnastics in trying to come up with kind of good arguments as to, you know, how to get them. And of course, you can always find analogies in the scriptures if you go looking for them. But I ask you, if this is celebrating the foundation of Clonmacnoise many hundred years before, and you've got, and by a king, of course, and by the High King at that, and then you've got these very secular scenes, for anybody looking at that, they're surely going to think more in terms of kingship and aristocratic power than they are going to be thinking of, I don't know, references to the Psalms or to the Bible. It's an interesting question, you know, the audience, and you get a different view if you start thinking, well, what would an average 10th century audience make of these actual panels? And just to make this point perhaps even more strongly, you see other bases. This is Kells, where you can see this series of troops lined up on the base. Again, echoes of the Book of Kells in all that. But the example I love is here at Old Kilcullen. Again, you see it's a broken cross, we don't have the top, but we do have this panel. And you've got that figure on the left, and he's holding out a crozier. And then beyond the crozier, there's a bell. And up above that, there's a square. What's that? Well, I think that has to be a book. And what we've got there are the 3 standard emblems or insignia of an Irish abbot: bull, but book, bell, and crozier. So this is an abbot, or a founding abbot, almost certainly. But he's got an axe, and he appears to be whacking a figure below. What's going on? But despite the fact that that language of the 3 elements should indicate immediately that this is a founding abbot, that is not how it's been interpreted. There have been suggestions, you know, it's going to be biblical. It's got to be, I don't know, Cain killing Abel or David killing Goliath or whatever. But literally, it can't be, because if you actually, I came across this almost by accident, discover or who the founder of the monastery at Old Kilcullen was, it was a follower of Patrick called MacTull. And what does Tull actually mean in Irish? But Adsi or axe. And that's exactly what he's got. This is the founder of Old Kilcullen. And there can't be any doubt. And he was a smith as well. So that would go well with the making of an axe. So we have a founder. So what I'm trying to say is that I think these crosses are more firmly implanted into the local community than sometimes people have been willing to recognize. But before I finish, I just want to bring the threads perhaps together a little bit, because most of the crosses I've been mentioning, there is McTull, most of the crosses I've been mentioning were curiously not just linked in time, but I think linked by people. So let's take Murdoch, who made the cross, the great cross at Monaster Boyce. Now, Murdoch wasn't any self-effacing Irish or abbot, some humble little figure. He was one of the grandest people of Eastern Ireland, High Steward of the Southern Union, Chief Counsel of all the men of Briga, lay and clerical. This is what his obit says. Deputy Abbot of Armagh. He was a big player. And of course, the fact that he was High Steward of the Southern O'Neill, and of course, who was the king, the O'Neill, who was the head? None other than Flann. And who was behind the cross at Clonmacnoise, of course? Flann, King Flann Sinner as well. You've got the inscription there, incidentally, going around the two cats. It seems fairly clear it's an addition. It isn't exactly the most elegant inscription you will ever get. So if we look at our group of monasteries, you've got Monaster Boyce there, but remember that Murdoch has connections in Armagh. Now it's interesting too that, and he's also got connections with Clonmacnoise undoubtedly as well. But then if we look a bit further, we discover that the abbot of Armagh at the time, Mael Brigta, and Murdoch was his deputy, he was also abbot. He was a two-timer. He was an abbot of Kells as well. So those two men must have known each other so well and must have been in pretty regular contact, one would suspect. And then, as I say, almost certainly the king, Flann Sinner, would have known them equally well. And interestingly, Durrow, I haven't said much about the Durrow cross, but there's an inscription which mentions a certain Dubtak, and he was a member of this same Columban community. He died in 938. Some would think that he was a cousin of Mael Brigta, and some would think that actually he was also abbot of Durrow. So in other words, all I'm really trying to say is that these crosses were massive undertakings. The patrons were acquainted with each other. They were some of the most powerful men of the time. And so the crosses are not just innocent sort of educational devices put up by a few devout abbots. These are almost proclamations, well, they are proclamations of status. So while ostensibly the crosses may have been erected for the glory of God, and of course they were in many ways, obviously they mustn't be too cynical, but they were also there to glorify particular places, particular sites, and, well, I better not hesitate to say it, particular individuals, the powerful men who actually paid for them. So basically, that's my take on the high crosses. And if you're convinced by what I say, well, get a bit more convinced, because there's the book you can read to go and look at it. And if you're unconvinced, well, you really do need to go and read the book to see the actual evidence. This is hot off the press, was launched just 2 weeks ago in what was to be a great celebration in Dublin. But of course, it didn't take place. But anyway, the book actually exists, and there it is. And that photograph, I remember taking that 2 years ago, and the sky was much bluer. And the designer said, you couldn't have a sky that blue in Ireland. You know, it's just not, wouldn't be right. And I said, and he toned it down. And I said, no, that we do get blue skies in Ireland. Oh my God, we've had one like that today too. Anyway, if you've been listening and are still there, thank you very much.
That's been absolutely fascinating, Professor. Thank you so much indeed. Brought so much of it to life. you know, the logistics, the technical skill, the humanity, the creativity, the humor, and even the social networking of the rich, powerful and famous, their whole network back then. It's been a fascinating lecture. And just to let people know who are listening in, your book was reviewed in the Irish Times on Saturday, April 25th, and that's available online. And you can also avail of purchasing the book online from Yale University Press, the Paul Mellon Foundation, and also at amazon.co.uk, price £40. And there are over 190 quality photographs in that book to bring the whole thing to life on top of your lecture as well. So thank you very much indeed. Now we have quite a few questions and lots of comments. Really appreciated your lecture. Someone was saying that it looks like the seated figure, that was the bishop that you referred to earlier, I think, is giving the sign of a blessing in the way that a bishop might seated on a cathedral chair. The hot pants that were referred to perhaps look like a Roman legionnaire in a leather-laid skirt, perhaps. There's another one, bishops hold staves, put down heresies. Looks like the seated figure, again, another one about the bishop. Fascinating discussion. Patrick Pearse's father and Willie Pearse made crosses which can be found around the country. There's even one on Achill Island, so the tradition of the Celtic cross is continuing. Someone wondering about the identity of the sculptor. And you're convinced he was Irish, but someone here is asking, was he an Italian master, perhaps?
Oh, you want me to answer that now?
Yeah. You don't.
Outrageous. Of course he's not. He's no. You see, if you're going to have an Italian sculptor here, the first thing is you wouldn't know the stone. Secondly, he would have to. Where would he get all the Irish elements that are in his work? He'd have to go for a crash course in Irish art for about 20 years, you know, to absorb it all. It's just so imbued with things which you're finding in the manuscripts, the metalwork. You know, and one of the arguments which is often made is that a lot of the imagery was brought over from the continent. Now, some of it clearly was, but I think that's vastly exaggerated, because if you had got, as it were, designs which are being copied from works in, for example, the Carolingian world in France, if they had been brought over, it wouldn't just be the design of the imagery. You'd have all the stylistic techniques and all the decoration and so on, and you get none of that in Ireland. So I'm very skeptical about the degree. And, you know, it's kind of funny because I'm English. I spend all the time trying to tell everybody these are fantastic works of Irish art. And they keep telling me the opposite, or trying to suggest, no, we've got to look to outside influences, and I don't really see it that way. No.
You know, and could I just ask you on this, that some medieval and Renaissance artists actually place themselves in a work of art discreetly in the background. Do you think our sculptor, our master craftsman or craftswoman has managed to do that?
Well, do you think he's one of those bearded fellows? That he and his assistant having a bit of a tussle. It's not, and I like the idea of, you know, the sculptor, because what that can be is that the sculptor has a certain identity, a self-identity, self-awareness. And I think in some of the witticisms and things, you know, it's not showing through in the actual sculpture, but in that he's kind of reflecting a certain degree, perhaps, of confidence and self-belief, because he is a confident, by the standard of the time, he's a confident sculptor.
Okay, so there's some other comments. Lovely carvings at Jerpoint Abbey. Someone points out that Jerpoint was much later, 12th century Gregorian Reform period. How do you determine if it's the work of one sculptor, very interesting question here, versus the work of those that duplicated his work? That's from Celine. Duplicated his work and style. Was it done in that era?
Yes, now that's a very good point. And it's not, you know, it's not a question which is just limited to this, because in any period of art where you don't really have names and clear indications, you've got a great problem, because if you've got works which look very alike and you attribute them to one individual, you know, how do you tell that from another? I mean, if obviously the thing that art historians have always done is to group similar techniques and style together and say, you know, that's the one artist. But connoisseurship, is called, you know, reached such degrees that you were finding people who were looking at a group of carvings, we'll say for the sake of argument, and finding minor differences and say, well, that must be a different hand, and start dividing everything up. And in other words, you've got to allow for the fact that a sculptor working over 20 years is not going to do everything the same. There are going to be variants. So perhaps the big question is, how significant is difference? Where you see differences, how significant is the difference? And the only way I would measure that is that, you know, if you see differences, but 85% is all the same, I think it's the same, you know, person. But it's a judgment, and I admit it's a tricky one. And certainly in one of the crosses at Kells, some of the carving is really quite a bit different. And yet other carving is dead on for this guy. So that looks as though maybe he's working with somebody else. And I would freely admit that's something of an open question. And I'm very keen to promote the idea of a single hand, because he's so different from everybody else. And if there were lots of other, you know, if you had lots of assistants who then went off elsewhere, I think you'd see that. I think you'd see sort of poorer versions of what he was trying to do. No, but it's a fair point. And, you know, it'd be great if people, you know, challenge what I say and you know, can actually come up with a good argument that, well, you know, maybe those two were by somebody else. But I can remember I was taught Lady of Sculpture by a lovely man, a Polish man, George Janecki, and he had a fantastic eye for you know, dividing things into hands. But they all said that all his students got a bit skeptical of it because, George, as we called him, he was just too keen to have too many sculptors. And, you know, you can't, you know, there isn't enough work to go around, you know. What I'm looking at is well within the compass of one man in a career, so I'm not bothered about that. But, you know, I freely accept that, you know, you've got to think of, you know, that possibility too.
Yeah, there's a supplementary question kind of goes with that from the one contributor, Claire Lyons, and she says that is it possible that there was a school or a workshop of apprentices working with him, maybe doing preliminary carving, outline or mock-ups, making tools, you know? Well, could you urge her to read the book? Because I talk about that. Okay, well, we'll save that one perhaps.
Oh, no, I'll just tell you what the thing is. The first thing, the idea of a workshop, that's a very Renaissance notion. You know, when you study Botticelli or whatever, or you know, any of those great Renaissance painters, they have assistants of all sorts, and you hear, and you know, all the connoisseurs, they're saying, oh, you can see the master only did the hay face, the hands, and actually it's documented, and it's clear that that's how it worked. But when you go back and you look at what sources we have for the Middle Ages, there's no real indication of that sort of a workshop, of a training. And what we can see, particularly from the century or so later in the Romanesque era, you can see very clear individuals. Now, they can't just be merely working on their own, because you're going to need help to turn stones over. But it seems that on the whole, you're dealing with very few people, one or two, who are really doing the, you know, the fundamental work, rather than have that sort of collaborative notion, which is something which I think comes a little bit, well, somewhat later, several centuries later, that sort of organizational notion. So I don't like the use of the word workshop, because it carries all these connotations of, you know, Renaissance practice, rather than us looking objectively back at the early Middle Ages to see what the evidence for that is like.
Okay. John Malloy says, a fantastic lecture, full of interest, very clear delivery. Ryan Fitzpatrick says, while iconography is always instructive, wouldn't these massive projects be connected with gifts by kings in exchange for prayers for their souls?
Ah, well, there's always an element of that, all right, because, you know, throughout the Middle Ages and on, the gift to the church was for the security of your soul. And it would be really interesting to know, you see, Clonmacnoise, of course, that was one of the major sites for the O'Neills. And it was, you know, it was their necropolis where they were buried. So, and, you know, there are good records of the kings presenting fine works of, well, I'm thinking particularly metalwork in the case of Clonmacnoise. So gifts, and you would certainly expect, I mean, the abbeys, you know, you hear of chalices and so on being presented by kings and so on. So there was certainly plenty of gifts. It would be interesting to know in terms of, I mentioned cost, and perhaps that's a bit misleading, because once you've got the carver and some sort of a labour force, what else do you require? It's the kind of physical side that you're paying for, but, you know, maybe kings have ways of ensuring that I mean, presumably they have the power to make things happen and get groups together to shift the stone and do all that sort of thing, except in one area where there might be cost. And I mentioned it briefly to you earlier, which was paint. And as they're painted, paint is going to be quite costly, I think, if you're going to cover large areas. So, you know, maybe gifts from potentates wouldn't go unwelcome if you had a great project, and certainly they would be delighted to get their name on the cross, as King Sam did.
Certainly would. Martin Byrne says, brilliant and fascinating lecture. Any comments on the carving of the horned figure between the two beasts on the market cross in Kells? Many thanks.
The horn figure.
Yeah.
Yes. That is amazing. That is one of the most amazing sculptures on this whole, and I think it's my man. I think, you know, he was the guy who did that. But yeah, it's a fantastical piece of sculpture, and very strange. And it's not the only kind of weird, where he got the imagination for that. It's tucked up on one side, up under the arm. If we got the same, I'm sure we have got the same piece of carving in mind. But I suppose, you see, what we'd all like to do is to find some, I don't know, remote source in, I don't know, ancient Roman art or something like that, which your man has copied. And he clearly had indirect access to things, you know. And one of the sources for some of the most extraordinary, particularly animal designs, seems to have come in fabrics imported from the East, from the Byzantine world and beyond. And, you know, maybe that's the place we should be looking for. But I never want to put too much weight on, you know, the source, because I think my guy is imaginative. Shouldn't call him my guy and get him possessive. But, you know, I think the guy is imaginative. And so often people will not give any credit. Everything has to have a source. But, you know, there's an imaginative element in all this. Yeah. So he's, you know, right to mention that.
Yeah. Mary Ann Marr says, really interesting lecture. Didn't realise there were so many examples of high crosses in Tipperary. Thank you for a fascinating insight into part of our Irish history.
A bit of irony there. I apologise for not having any more. But, well, yeah, you can't beat that group, I'm afraid.
Okay. Michael C. says, fantastic talk. Your book definitely will have to go onto the Christmas wish list. Frisian Fraggle says, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge, so engaging and entertaining. Anne Caroline says, great stuff, thanks so much. Hilary McGeever says, wonderful, thanks. BZ Han says, thank you. Geraldine, really brilliant, thank you. Bianca says, thank you so much for your lecture, so fascinating, never thought of the logistics. Peter Manson, thank you. Celine Collins, incredible talk. Love the visuals, pace, the structure of the talk. It was all just amazing. Thank you so much. Fascinating, great stories. Thank you, says Helen. Talea, fantastic lecture.
You have to calm down a bit, Donny.
We've so many messages coming in here. Here's a technical one. Could mortise and tenon jointed crosses have been assembled on the ground, cemented, lime and mortar, and then raised using a wooden frame by tilting up rather than a lifting hoist?
That's an interesting idea. I hadn't thought of that. I just wouldn't have thought that whatever joint you would be that stable. It would all be a bit precarious, but it's an interest, because you see he's onto one thing which did worry me a lot, because if you've got two sections lying on the ground, you'd have to try and make sure they fitted, wouldn't you, before you obviously attempted to put it up. So they must have put the socket into the mortise on the ground to try it out at the very least. So, and if you put it all into some massive timber frame, you might be able to do it that way. Well, I wish you'd told me that before. That's a really interesting alternative. I think you're still going to need pretty impressive lifting machinery.
Yeah. That was from Glenn Collins. Frances says, enjoy that no end, many thanks. Jutta says, thank you so much for a fabulous lecture, so interesting to listen to. Jesse MacDonald, really enjoyable lecture. Thank you to everyone who made it possible. Minota McGillicuddy, brilliant. Never knew there was so much to our Irish crosses. Can't wait to get the book and learn more. Thank you, Roger. Bevine, always a wonderful lecture from Roger Stalley. Ryan Fitzpatrick, why were so many crosses on the borders of Irish kingdoms?
Oh, now, I'm not sure my historical geography is good enough to be sure of that. But he's right that there are some quite clearly, and particularly the famous Aheny crosses are right on a border. And, there's been a lot of discussion as to whether their location had much to do with boundaries and borders and establishing boundaries. And that goes straight, of course, into, your local politics of the 9th, 10th. It's a very interesting area. I think and I mentioned Aheny there, which is particularly interesting because it isn't the site of a known monastery. And it's perhaps important to make the point that a lot of the crosses, perhaps less so the ones, the highly sculptured ones, are not necessarily in a monastery. They're on ecclesiastical sites. So particularly when they're away from a major monastic site, it's very tempting to say that they're doing far more than just being a cross erected in a graveyard or anything like that. So he's, it's certainly something which it has been discussed a certain degree, but I think more, because I think there's a massive political dimension in all sorts of ways to these monuments. They're just too big to be taken for granted as just, some sort of initiative on the part of a local abbot.
Yeah, that was from Ryan Fitzpatrick. Glenn Collins says, how many separate sculptors have been identified across all of the known crosses?
Oh, now the problem you have there is that a lot of crosses are plain or relatively plain, but you do have, there's another sculptor who is clearly identifiable, and he's the Moon Man. That guy who did the Cross of Moon. And I think you can pick him up at several sites. And one of the things that I didn't fully appreciate this until recent years is those crosses, of course, are all in granite. And you think, well, you cross one guy carving in sandstone was carving granite. But actually, when you speak to the sculptors and when you look to the past, carving granite is a very different proposition from carving sandstone. And you hit the granite, apparently the standard way, I've never done it myself, is you hit the granite more or less kind of vertically straight on, you smash it with a point. And it's the very textured granite, which is so difficult. And so the techniques are quite different. So that's a kind of interesting distinction. And there you almost feel you've got a specialist. based in the Barrow Valley there somewhere. And but it's not that easy, of course. The other thing which gives us a great advantage with the ones I've talked about is they're quite well preserved. And in many cases, you know, the sculpture is almost too far gone for you to really make a clear assessment as to whether it's going to tie up with other things or not.
Mm-hmm.
But one thing that again, I think comes out of it, in years gone by, it was quite easy to put the crosses into various groups. But the way of thinking was always, well, if you've got various groups, certainly archaeologically, you want to put them in a time frame. So one comes first. But I don't believe that. I think a lot of these are happening at more or less the same time. And they're local reflections or local ways of doing it, rather than us automatically having to put everything into, you know, quite a long sequence. And that's what people have realized, not just in Ireland, but in other countries, in England, with the carvings and works there too.
Thank you. Paddy Haughey says, a marvellous revelation of our wonderful heritage. John Sheehy, really enjoyed every minute. Thank you. Very interesting. Thanks, Paula Healy. Ryan Fitzpatrick, if the sculptor was Italian, would he not have included the Roman eagle? Maybe that could comment on the eagle earlier. Vivian, another wonderful lecture by Robert Stalley. Any Coptic images? Interesting, from Galaxy A5. Any Coptic images? You had referred to the Byzantine, but any Coptic?
Well, one very obvious one, and I didn't dwell on it, but the image of the judging Christ has him with his arms crossed and over, and up one side you have the cross, and up the other side you have a flowering rod. The ancient Egyptian gods, Osiris, had exactly that pose, and it has to come ultimately from Egypt. Now, how it got here and why it was taken over, but the Egyptian judging, you know, the whole idea of judging, and a number of other ideas to do with the dead, the weighing of the souls in a weighing scale, that's almost certainly coming out of that background. Maybe not necessarily the Copts, but even further back. And so, yeah, he's right. And the fashion for Egypt in sort of Irish history and archaeology kind of waxes and wanes. There have been some scholars who rather stressed it, and others who've then dismissed the idea. But in recent years, we've had to take Egypt much more seriously, partly because of finds in Mount Sinai, but also this very interesting thing. You remember the Psalter that was found in the bog? Mm-hmm. Well, you know, that had certain Egyptian elements. Okay. So that is to the bindings, that is. And, you know, that again woke everybody up. Right. This was a far-flung world in which things are being shipped and moved around, particularly portable. Obviously.
A lot more connections, perhaps, than we previously had ever imagined, really, from different parts of the world, you know?
Yeah, well, there's certainly a lot of movement throughout the Mediterranean, to the Roman world and beyond, and to the Holy Land, of course.
These icons would have been standardized across the Christian world, but it would have been an anathema to insert oneself into an icon, said Ryan Fitzpatrick. Finola Finley, how do you feel about the real crosses being indoors and reproductions placed outside at Clonmacnoise, for example?
Oh, you're trying to get me into trouble.
Well, we can kick the touch on that one, perhaps.
I think. I mean, I would always be very sad when the crosses have to be moved indoors. And one of the prime reasons for that is that I mentioned that north side of the cross of Murdoch, and you know that just on relative few days in the year you can stand in, if you're lucky with the sun. Suddenly the sun comes across that, and you're there. You know, you're there seeing the light on that cross in a way that, you know, the folk 1,000 years ago saw it. And the light, it's the light, the sun moving round the cross, you know, starting on one side, and then it goes into shadow, and then it highlights. And of course, the relief of these carving is such that it brings out figures in different ways as the sun goes round. Now you lose all that when it's brought inside, except that, and I'd love, you know, OPW to think about this, maybe if they ever get any more money now, but when they are brought indoors, it's not that difficult nowadays to actually mimic the movement of the sun in the lighting. So you could do something like that, but it's still not the same as being out there. Another thing is that just because you bring a cross indoors doesn't necessarily guarantee that, you know, they're safe from decay, because these monuments have been out for 1,000 years. And when you bring them indoors, you know, it's a completely different environment for the stone. And I've always maintained that I would like to see monitoring of the crosses inside as well as outside, because, you know, I do just wonder whether some of them actually are, you know, whether they're actually suffering a bit indoors. I better say no more than that, but that's no more than a suspicion. So it would be sad if that has to happen, but one can see. But the cross, I might say, a Clonmac noise, the replacement is pretty convincing. And I can, perhaps I shouldn't say this, that one quite distinguished lecturer I know who visited Cashel many years back with a large party, and he was giving a talk in front of the cross, the 12th century cross at Cashel, and then was horror struck when he went into the visitor area and discovered that was where the real cross was, and he'd been telling them all about the facsimile which had been put up there. So you can see how anybody who leads groups gets a bit nervous about these sort of things. But I accept, yes, there are going to be times when it's going to have to be done. But the algae and that sort of thing, maybe, you know, if our climate would improve. I was told by the botanists that particularly the lichens now, you know, they like damp weather, but the thing they don't like are a lot of the modern fumes, nitrogens and so on. So, you know, if you want to clear the lichen, it's not a bad idea to have a motorway running past, because it might clear the lichens, but that's a rather big price to pay, perhaps, for keeping them clean. But it is an interesting fact that, you know, even something like that, the actual local environment can affect the way things look. Anyway, yeah.
Just a few more last comments. Michael Keating, a wonderful lecture as expected. Thank you to all involved. Hope to see more quality lectures make their way out into the university in the future. Boundary markers, wonderful lecture from Andrew and Anne in Cornwall. Very informative lecture, says Patrick Niall Lynham. A 3D model of a cross I made from a graveyard in Ballinacurra near Middleton in County Cork. Interesting one, perhaps we'll finish with. Why didn't these crosses catch on more in Britain? We were talking a little bit about this earlier. The connections between, or... Yes.
Now, in Britain, and I'll take England maybe particularly, there were certainly many very impressive Saxon crosses which were going up from the late 7th century. We particularly think of Northumbria, but it wasn't only Northumbria, it was in Kent and so on. Very few of them survived beyond the, well, some did, but a lot of them did not survive beyond the Norman conquest. And when the sites on which they were placed were, you know, began to see these vast, great Romanesque Norman buildings being put up, you know, the crosses were sacrificed. They were, I suppose, assumed to be archaic. And I mentioned that the survival of paint. Now, the paint has been found on pieces of crosses which were reused in 12th century buildings. And of course, because they'd been built into the wall, the paint has survived in a way that it wouldn't if it'd been outside. So, you know, you can find plenty of remains at a very early date of butchered crosses. So there were crosses, but as I stressed earlier, they took a very different form, not this very distinctive circular form. There are some in Wales, and there's one or two in what is now called Scotland, modern Scotland. But predominantly, yes, they're an Irish thing. And wherever you go in the world, of course, that's the mark. I mean, one of the really interesting things about the way this is the whole idea of the ring and so on, that's a very Christian sacred thing. But of course, that with the rediscovery of these crosses in the 19th century, that becomes so closely identified with Irish identity and Irish nationalism. So the ring cross almost changed its meaning from a Christian to a sign of Ireland and Irishness. So we all know wherever we are in the world, you come across a ring. Couldn't believe it. A few years back, I was in St. Louis, and I was beside the, the great arch, the Cistercian Arch, beside the river, the Mississippi, and then you walk towards the centre of St. Louis. It's all very modern, of course, and then there was a ring cross, and it was put up by those who had emigrated from Ireland, and it was put up quite recently, actually, as a mark of all that they had contributed to St. Louis. So what was a kind of Christian symbol then has become a great, as it were, national symbol.
So just unfortunately, we've nearly run out of time, and we won't get to all of the comments, but everyone is delighted with the lecture and thrilled. If you want to get a copy of the book, as I've already mentioned, it's on the website for Yale University Press, the Paul Mellon Foundation. It's also available on amazon.co.uk. And if you know somebody who may have missed the lecture, you can catch it again on the YouTube Trasna na Tíre channel, and just to keep an eye out for upcoming lectures on Trasna na Tíre's Facebook page. So thank you once again, Professor Roger Stalley, for a fascinating, fabulous and well delivered lecture.
Well, thank you all for listening, and thank you all those people for all those very kind comments. Much appreciated.
Not at all. Thank you very much.